So my name is David Detmer. I'm a professor of philosophy at Purdue University Northwest, which is in the northwest corner of the state near Indiana. And I do research on lots of different subjects. I've written 7 books and lots of articles. And one of the things I've done work on is capital punishment, the death penalty. But so what I thought I would do in talking about capital punishment is to start off by mentioning that there are at least two very different theories of what punishment is supposed to be for. So one theory is sometimes called the utilitarian theory, and that one says that the purpose of punishment is social benefit. So, the rationale that we have for punishing people who have been convicted of crimes is to bring about some kind of social benefit. So, examples of possible social benefit would include incapacitating criminals. So, if you've got someone who's going around committing murders, committing rapes, or what have you, if they are apprehended and locked up, then we are safe from them. So that's the idea of incapacitation. Crime deterrence, the idea there is that by having penalties for committing crimes, some would-be criminals might be dissuaded from committing the crime. It's like they're thinking, okay, I want to commit this crime, but if I get caught, I might be punished, and I don't want that, so then I won't commit the crime. So that's the crime deterrence idea. And then finally, rehabilitation. So some people have thought that a good thing to do in a system of punishment, if you've got someone confined in jail or what have you, then maybe they could get some job training or some education or some medical help or some psychiatric help or what have you. Now that's expensive. And because of that, we're not doing that as much as we used to in the United States. So I'm going to come back and talk about the utilitarian theory in connection with the death penalty in just a minute. But first, I'll mention the other prominent theory, and that is called the retributivist theory. And that's the one that says the purpose of punishment is simply to administer justice. So now we're not talking about social benefit like deterrence or anything like that. The idea is that justice involves giving people what they deserve. So if you, excuse me, if you have done the best job in some contest, then you deserve the first place trophy as a matter of justice. So you do something positive, you should get a positive outcome, praise or a reward or whatever it might be. And then similarly, it is claimed that if you commit a crime, you deserve to be punished as a matter of justice. So that's what the retributivist theory is about. So I'm going to talk about those two theories in connection with capital punishment. So let's start with the utilitarian theory. So if you remember, I mentioned these 3 benefits that utilitarians think you can sometimes get with punishment. 2 of them really don't work for capital punishment. You don't need to execute people to incapacitate them. Again, if someone's going out committing murder or committing rape or what have you, if they are locked up, that prevents them from doing that. You don't need to execute them to incapacitate them. And then obviously you can't achieve rehabilitation with capital punishment. If you kill someone, obviously you're not rehabilitating them. So with utilitarianism, the issue kind of comes down to crime deterrence. So then the big question is, do you get greater crime deterrence with capital punishment than you do with the alternatives, such as a long prison sentence? So there's been a lot of social science research on this. And while there is not a complete consensus, by far the majority of the studies that have been done have concluded that there's no evidence that you get greater deterrent value with capital punishment as opposed to lesser penalties. So the kinds of studies that have been done, I mean, the initial studies were just doing things like comparing similar states, states that have a similar demographic, similar population density, similar economic levels, that kind of thing, where one has capital punishment and the other does not, and you find there's not a difference in the murder rate. Or you look at a state that didn't have capital punishment and then it instituted it, or a state that had it and then abolished it, you don't see any significant change in the murder rate. And there are other more sophisticated studies where you look at a whole bunch of different variables. A very small number of those have claimed to find a deterrent effect to capital punishment, but as I mentioned, the vast majority of them do not. They conclude we can't find any deterrent value in capital punishment beyond what you get from other punishments. So then we go to the various common sense arguments that are made, because some people say, social science is very difficult. It's hard to know what is the cause of what. There are so many factors that might influence the crime rate. So it's hard to isolate exactly what is the effect of capital punishment versus other factors. So I'm going to give you what might be called a kind of common sense argument that capital punishment is a uniquely effective crime deterrent, but then I'll give you a rebuttal to that argument. So the argument that it is a uniquely effective crime deterrent goes like this. The first premise is the more you are afraid of something, the more you want to avoid it, then the more deterrent value you will get from imposing that penalty. So think about like a parking violation. If the penalty for a parking violation is just $2, a lot of people aren't that afraid of having to pay a $2 fine. So if they want to park there, they'll just park there. Whereas if it's a $50 fine, they'd think twice about it unless they're pretty rich. If you make it a $1,000 fine, that's going to have more deterrent value. You can see where this is going. So then the argument is people are more afraid of death, more afraid of being executed than they are of going to prison. And there is actually some evidence to support that. For example, people who are sentenced to death, often on appeal, will request that the sentence be reduced to a long prison sentence, whereas it's more rare for it to go the other way. Someone who's been sentenced to a long prison sentence asking instead to be executed. That does sometimes happen, but it's much more rare. So you put those two premises together. Premise one, the more you're afraid of something, the more the threat of it deters you. People are more afraid of being executed than of going to prison for a long time. Therefore, you get more deterrent value with capital punishment. So that's a kind of common sense argument for it. But I can give you a rebuttal to that argument. The rebuttal is a little more complicated, but it goes like this. The logic of deterrence depends on people having a certain degree of rationality and a certain degree of self-control. So rationality, they have to actually be thinking, okay, I want to kill this person, but on the other hand, I don't want to be caught and convicted and sentenced to death. Now I'm going to weigh these against each other. That's a fairly high degree of rationality. And you also need self-control. Oftentimes when someone commits a murder, it's because they are enraged, they're furious, they're jealous, they're, whatever it is, they have this violent impulse. So for deterrence to work, you have to be able to control that violent impulse. You have to have self-control. So then one more concept is what I need to finish this argument, and that is the concept of a threshold. So let's go back to the parking violation thing. So I'll use myself as an example. If there's a fine for parking in the wrong place on my campus and the fine is $2, that's not going to deter me. If I'm in a hurry, if I might be late for class, I don't mind risking a $2 fine. If it's a $50 fine, that's good. I'll think twice about that. If it's a $1,000 fine, I'm definitely not going to do it. I can't afford to pay a $1,000 fine. If it's a year in prison, I'd be so afraid of that, I probably wouldn't even dare park on campus. So notice this, though. I'm more afraid of 2 years in prison than one. I'm more afraid of 5 years than two, and so on. But at a certain point, you've reached a threshold where I am deterred. Okay, I'm scared enough of that. I'm not going to do it. So even if I'm more scared of an even harsher penalty, you get no extra deterrent value because you've already deterred me. So now let's put these points together. And the rebuttal to that common sense argument would go something like this. Anyone who is rational and who has self-control is very likely to be deterred by the threat of a long prison sentence. Going to prison for a long time is no picnic. That's a really bad deal. So someone who's rational and has self-control, and they're in a situation where they actually have a desire to kill someone, they're likely to be deterred by that. On the other hand, people who don't have rationality and self-control, they can't be deterred by anything. So in order for capital punishment to get you this unique deterrent value, you'd have to be talking about a person who would be reasoning this way. I want that person dead so badly, I'm willing to spend the rest of my life in prison to see them dead, but I'm not willing to be executed for it. That's probably a vanishingly small number of people, and perhaps it's the null set. Perhaps it's no one. One other point that sort of buttresses this is already there are all kinds of dangers of dying and committing crimes. You probably know that in America, more so than just about any other country in the world, lots of people have guns. So if you break into someone's house, if you're a burglar, there's a good chance of being shot if someone is at home. Also, the police kill people in the act of committing crimes at a very high rate also. So it's hard to understand how the threat of a remote execution is going to bring about greater deterrent value than you already get from things like that. Further evidence for that, there's a lot of research to show that whereas people can be deterred by immediate threats, not so much distant threats, distant in time. If you want to do something and it's not going to hurt you in the short run, but it might hurt you 10 years later, that doesn't seem to deter people. Think of all the unhealthy things people do. Smoking cigarettes, for example, driving without wearing their seatbelt and so on. If there's not an immediate threat of a bad consequence, there seems to be little deterrent effect. So as I see it, the evidence, not only does the social science evidence not seem to indicate that capital punishment is a uniquely effective crime deterrent, but these common sense arguments don't really go in that direction either. Now, there's another kind of argument that some proponents of capital punishment use where they think it has a uniquely effective crime deterrent. So these are people who say, yeah, our opponents, the enemies of capital punishment, they probably have a good point about rationality and self-control and so on. But maybe it works more like this. It's about social messaging. When you just send someone to jail, you're kind of sending the message that what they did is not absolutely intolerable. We'll continue to let them live. Odds are eventually we'll let them out of prison and they can resume normal life. So these people who make this argument, they say, we kind of send the message that what they did, although it's bad, it's tolerable. But when you execute someone, you're saying what you did is absolutely intolerable. We're no longer willing to share the planet with you. You must die. And so some defenders of capital punishment think that message gets internalized. So even if you're dealing with someone who's not very rational, doesn't have much self-control, they might still just sort of internalize the message that murder is just absolutely beyond the pale. You can't be, you're just an awful person if you commit murder, and so they won't do it. But there's a rebuttal to this argument as well. And the rebuttal is that it's a mixed message. On the one hand, yeah, I suppose there is this message that murder is absolutely intolerable, but there's also the message that the proper way to deal with bad people is violence, is to kill them. And so the logic of deterrence sort of implies that if you're a would-be criminal, you're identifying with the person being executed and saying, I don't want to be like him. I don't want to be executed. I don't want to be a bad person the way he is. What if you instead identify with the state? Hey, look at what they're doing to this bad guy. They're killing him. That's what we ought to do with bad people, kill them. Someone in my life I'm dealing with is a bad person. That's an appropriate way to deal with that person, by killing them. So the message is at best mixed. So that's what I wanted to say about the utilitarian argument. Just to sum up, the other two values of utilitarianism, incapacitation and rehabilitation, they don't support capital punishment. The only one that has a fighting chance is crime deterrence. But both the social science research and the common sense arguments, I think, suggest it probably is not a more effective crime deterrent than alternatives. Now, I do have things to say about retributivism, and I have other points to make about capital punishment, but I've been kind of lecturing for a while. But maybe I should stop here for a moment and just ask if there are any questions or comments on anything I've said up to now.
Like, which form of capital punishment is more popular?
He was saying, like, what were the most common methods of execution?
In our country's history, lots of things have been done. We used to have the electric chair where people were electrified. We had hanging. We had firing squads. I think we even used gas, if I'm remembering correctly. I haven't researched this in a while, but I think that's accurate. Now, in more recent times, the method has been lethal injection. Yeah, I think there are other methods that are still on the books, but primarily what's been done in recent years is lethal injection. Oh, maybe I forgot to mention hanging. Hanging is another one that we used to do.
Since you talked about lethal injection, how, I guess, efficient are they? I thought I had read something before about often they actually go wrong and they're actually really expensive and more expensive than actually just having someone sit in jail for X amount of years.
Yes, so you're absolutely right. Allegedly, the original motivation of moving to lethal injection would be that it would be more humane than the other methods. But you are correct. Oftentimes it's sort of botched. Oftentimes something doesn't go wrong. Something goes wrong, where it's very painful and it takes a long time for the person to die, and so on. And then the point about expense, that's really interesting. That's very counterintuitive. Almost everyone assumes that, of course, it's going to be way more expensive to keep someone alive in jail for like 60 years or whatever, giving them 3 meals a day and all that kind of stuff. That's super expensive. How about we just execute them? That'll be way less expensive. Turns out it's not true. And this is one point about the capital punishment debate where I think there is a consensus. I think the supporters of capital punishment, for the most part, concede this point. The reason why, as I mentioned, it's very, very counterintuitive. People are kind of stumped when they hear this. The reason has to do with legal fees, because there are many other kinds of crimes where if the trial was properly run, so there's not good grounds for appeal, so it's clear the person is guilty, there's really not any basis for an appeal, and so you don't have those fees. But with capital punishment, because you're talking about putting someone to death, in our system, there's some effort to be extra careful. So there are lots of grounds for appeals. Moreover, we don't execute everyone who commits murder. So even if it's obvious that a given person committed a murder, there might still be grounds for them to appeal the death sentence. Oh, this case would be more appropriate for a long prison sentence instead. So the long story short, with capital punishment, there tend to be lots and lots of appeals. And that means the state has to pay legal fees. And you probably know lawyers, especially when it goes to trial, they are very, very expensive. So much so that the legal fees end up being way higher than the total expense of keeping someone in jail for 60 years, paying, giving them 3 meals a day and so forth.
What is the rate of those that we find innocent? I think I came across before, maybe it's called the Innocence Project. Is that correct?
Yeah, there is something called the Innocence Project where they use the main thing that they use is DNA. So this has kind of revolutionized criminal defense. It used to be that when you were talking about physical evidence left at a crime scene, so oftentimes the murderer will have left physical evidence at the crime scene. They will have left behind hair or blood, or if rape is involved, semen, whatever it might be. There's part of their body is left behind, something from their body. And so it used to be you could only go so far with that. So like with blood, you could determine whether it was the same blood type as the suspect. Is it AB negative or whatever? That's as far as you could go. But now I don't know that I can put a date on this, but now they have DNA technology, which is much, much more precise. It's often as precise, if not more so, than a fingerprint. So a much more precise thing. And so there have been many, many cases where someone has been convicted, oftentimes convicted in a trial where there was no DNA testing, either because the defendant didn't have enough money to pay for such testing and the state didn't do it, or maybe the crime happened before such testing was available. But in any case, there have been many cases in which someone was convicted, they hadn't tested the DNA. On appeal, they do test the DNA, and lo and behold, it exonerates the person who was convicted. Nope, not their blood, not their semen or hair. And look here, it matches that of some other known criminal who was on the loose at that time and in the area. So now we know who really did it. So I live in Indiana, but I live very, very near Illinois. So I get all the media like from Chicago. And famously, there was a governor, George Ryan. He was a Republican, he was a conservative, he was for capital punishment. But he ended up commuting the sentences of all the people on death row in Illinois. It didn't mean he set them free, but he changed their sentences from the death sentence to prison. And the reason is 13 different people on death row in Illinois were subsequently exonerated by DNA testing. So now, if I may, Jonathan, I want to ask your students a question. This is just kind of a fun question. So here are all of these people who were convicted in a trial, found guilty, ready to be executed, and then the DNA conclusively proved they were not guilty. And the question I want to ask you is, what do you suppose was the evidence that got them convicted? Given that they were not guilty, what evidence persuaded juries to convict them, if you had to guess?
I think, like, if someone like accused them of raping them, they could execute them for that.
So you mean like an accusation, like somebody
Yeah.
said it, like a testimony?
Maybe just witnesses, like not seeing a good like view of it.
Okay, so witnesses and what they see.
So I thought I heard witnesses and what they see. Was that one of them?
Yep.
That was the one that's what I said.
It turns out that in the majority of those cases in Illinois, the crucial evidence that led to a conviction was signed confession. So these people had signed a confession that they committed a crime that in fact they had not committed. So what happened was at trial, they had said, we were beaten, we were tortured by the police, and that's why we signed a confession. They said they wouldn't stop the torture until we signed. Juries didn't believe that. They said, well, look, we've got, the prosecutor said, look, we've got this signed confession. So it turns out there was a Chicago police officer named John Burge, Burge. He ended up going to prison over this. This was his method. You know, if they arrested some criminal and he thought they were guilty, but they didn't have good enough evidence, he and his officers would just beat a confession out of them. So you've probably seen that in movies and TV shows. I've seen sometimes where it's kind of defended. It's like, oh, you know, the cops, they know who really did it and they've got to cut corners. But in this case, we see in many cases these people were not guilty. So yes, this is another objection to capital punishment that, I mean, obviously, any kind of criminal punishment, there's the problem that you might convict someone wrongly. Someone who is not guilty ends up being convicted. That's a horrible thing, no matter what the penalty is. But there's something special about the death penalty in that if someone gets some lesser penalty, they can get some kind of compensation. If someone's wrongly been sent to prison, well, they can't get those years back, that's true, but they can be released and resume their life and get their good name restored, and even in some cases get a financial, some kind of financial compensation from the state. But if you're dead, you're gone. You know, death is irrevocable. So that's an argument that many people make against capital punishment. This is what led to capital punishment being outlawed in England. There was a famous case of a man named, I think his name was Timothy Evans, if I remember correctly, where he was convicted of murdering his wife and child. And he was executed. And then it later came out, he lived like in a duplex, and the person living upstairs was a serial killer who murdered a whole bunch of people, and they were able to discover he had killed this man's wife and child. So the nation was outraged and horrified that they had executed this innocent man, and that led to the death penalty being overturned there. So some defenders of capital punishment, they don't base it on any utilitarian consideration. They don't base it on deterrence or anything like that. They base it on what they claim justice demands. And here, a big part of that is the idea of proportionality. And what I mean by proportionality is a serious crime should get a serious penalty. A minor crime should get a minor penalty. And to give them their due, I think we do tend to agree with that. We do tend to be outraged if someone commits some minor infraction and they get a serious penalty. Like there was a case some years ago of a man named John Sinclair. This is back like in the 1960s or 70s, where because of 2 marijuana cigarettes, he got 10 years in prison. You know, that's an overly harsh penalty, no matter what you think about the legalization of marijuana. We tend to be outraged by that. And then conversely, someone might commit some heinous crime and they get a little slap on the wrist, and we tend to be outraged by that. So it does seem to be part of our sense of justice that there should be some kind of proportion. We say, you know, the punishment should fit the crime. So how some retributivists use this to defend capital punishment is they use the eye for an eye idea. Well, if you killed, then the appropriate punishment is for you to be killed. And the counter argument to that, there's an article by a philosopher named Stephen Nathanson called An Eye for an Eye, and I like the way he makes the point. He argues that in general, we do not punish criminals that way. We punish them in terms of proportion, that's right, but we don't tend to do to the criminal what the criminal did in committing the crime. So I'm just going to read here some of his examples. Like he says that what would we do to embezzlers? You know, you can't embezzle embezzlers. How about spies? We don't spy on spies. Drunken drivers, how would you do to them what they did? airline hijackers. We can't we can't hijack their airlines. They don't have airlines. Air polluters. We can't just pollute the air of air polluters because you can't contain it, and so on and so forth. How about this one? Persons who practice medicine without a license. What are we going to do in penalty? As a penalty, practice medicine on them without a license, and so on. So pretty much we never do to criminals in punishment what they do in committing their crime. So it would be an arbitrary and inconsistent deviation from our standard practice if we said in the case of murder, oh, you killed, so you must be killed. And then the other thing that goes along with that is one of our considerations is, although we want serious punishments for serious crimes, there's a limit to what we want to do because we don't want to sink too low. So we don't torture torturers, we don't rape rapists, that kind of thing. And so consistent with retributivism, one could argue murder certainly deserves a strong punishment, but perhaps we don't want as the state to be involved in killing. So that's a kind of counter argument based on retributivism. All right, I will stop there and throw it open for more questions or comments.
What do you think is the biggest misconception with capital punishment and the death penalty?
Yeah, I really don't know the answer. I will say that I think a lot of people have misconceptions about deterrence. A lot of people just assume that, because death is so frightening, it must be a very effective crime deterrent. I'm always very frustrated by the quality of political debate. People don't, politicians don't go into any kind of detail. It'll tend to be, they'll just say, oh, I think it's a deterrent. Oh, in fact, this is not responsive to your question exactly, but since I'm talking about politicians, this is something else that's relevant to capital punishment. Back in, I guess it would have been 2000, when George W. Bush, then the governor of Texas, was running for president. And in one of the debates he had, this was a debate format where citizens in the audience were asking the questions, not journalists. And so a citizen asked him a question about the high rate of capital punishment in Texas. At that time, Texas was executing people more than any other state. Now it's Florida, then it was Texas. The person asked him, are you proud of that? Are you proud that your state kills more people, this way than other states? Bush looked a little taken aback, and he said, oh no, I wouldn't say we're proud of it. But then he pivoted and said, but I can look you right in the eye and assure you that every one of those people who was executed got a fair trial. That I can assure you. Now, I lead a rich fantasy life, so I sometimes think about what I would have said if I would have been up there on the stage debating him. Al Gore, all he did was just say, well, I'm for the death penalty too. That was his response. My response would have been, okay, you say you can look that young man in the eye and say that all of the people executed in Texas when you were governor got a fair trial. Let me ask you this, Governor Bush. In every case, was their state-appointed defense attorney awake during the trial? In every case, was their state-appointed defense attorney sober during the trial? And the reason I would have asked those questions, there were two cases that went to the Texas Supreme Court where that was the basis for the appeal. The attorney for the accused slept through the trial in one case. In another case, he was drunk during the trial. And when it went to the Supreme Court, the attorneys for the state of Texas conceded those points. Yes, we noticed he was drunk. Yes, we noticed he was sleeping. But that did not get the sentence overturned because the Supreme Court said, the Supreme Court of Texas, the record didn't make it clear whether they were asleep or drunk, as the case may be, during crucial parts of the trial. They just know they were drunk during part of it or asleep during part of it. So, when you're putting people to death, you would think maybe you would want better safeguards than to allow. Anyway, there you go.
Would you be able to end on a note giving advice to social studies students?
I would say, pick issues that interest you, issues that make a difference to people's lives, study them carefully. And if you think the evidence warrants a particular conclusion that has public policy implications, fearlessly advocate for that. That's a way to make the world better.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming.